this episode of Quake It Up. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at 5 of my Quaker heroes, shall we say, or maybe 5 Quakers who I think, if I had to pick like my favourite ones, who might they be and why? So here we go. So I've done this in kind of chronological order, and I've really had, and I've stuck to 5 as best I could. Obviously, I really had to think about how I was going to do that, but I've tried my best. So we're going to look at the oldest one first, if that makes sense. So the first of my Quaker heroes that I have chosen is Mary Fisher. Now, Mary Fisher, it was one of the first ever Quakers. So she was part of a group called the Valiant 60, who were basically the ones who went across England in 2 by 2, spreading Quakerism as they went. She is a Yorkshire woman from York, well, from Selby, which is very close. So from the right county at least. So fantastic. And she became a very early convert to Quakerism. She was converted by George Fox. So very much at the centre there of Quakerism. Now, and she just had a brilliant. Well, it doesn't sound certainly some parts of it didn't sound brilliant, but just to read about, fascinating. So she was the first Quaker, along with another woman, to be publicly flogged, so publicly assaulted, shall we say, in Cambridge. And she was in prison multiple times in York as well, which upsets me as the true capital of Quakerism. But obviously, at the time, it was still becoming that. So poor behaviour from York at the time. But it's nice to know that they made it up later on with some cracking Quakers as the years progressed. And she travelled all over the place. She went to Barbados, where lots of Quakers went, and she also went to Boston, where her books were seized because they were filled with blasphemous stuff, which is, shame on those Puritans. But she's most famous for travelling to the Ottoman Empire, which is probably not the area of the world where you'd expect a Quaker woman, especially, to be going. And I believe she went by herself, or not with very many people, which is again quite bizarre. It's not completely out of the ordinary. So for example, there were Quakers that went to the papacy to tell the Pope that he was a heretic, which didn't go too well, but nice to try. But going to the Ottoman Empire, literally into, at this time, this is when the Ottoman Empire was doing really quite well, and people were very concerned that the Ottomans were going to, be, come into Europe and all that sort of stuff, and so that she went over there is quite amazing and baffling and fascinating. Most of all, she actually met with the Sultan and had like a personal meeting with the Sultan, which it's this woman from Selby, in the presence of Mehmed IV, and saying why Islam is wrong and why Quakerism is great. It's just wonderful. I'm enthralled by this, and I every time I just can't believe it happened. And he didn't like chop a head off or do anything horrible to her. He was like, oh, okay, yeah, fair enough, and protected her, which is much better behavior from Sultan Mehmed IV than the city of York at the time. So well done him. And eventually she went back, she married, and eventually emigrated to the Carolinas. So again, showing this the Quaker transatlantic world, right at the very beginning. And so I just think for her journeys, the fact that she was a woman and did what she did, that she was an early Quaker, that she was from Yorkshire. It's all good stuff. So I think she certainly comes in not necessarily number one like that, but like number one. If I had to choose one of the Valiant 60, that's who I'm going with. My second Quaker hero, I have gone for Isaac Pennington. So a second generation Quaker. So he was So I mean, he was actually older than Mary Fisher, but came to Quakerism later, if that makes sense. He's a very different type of Quaker. He definitely isn't from Yorkshire. He's quite well to do. He's from a he was from a Puritan background, and he was the son of the Lord Mayor of London. So we can't be more different from Mary Fisher here. No, and he also went to Cambridge. So yeah, so he studied law. He is very well to do, and shocked the London scene by when him and his wife Mary, who's also fascinating. But I could have done a two for one, but I wasn't going to be cheeky, so I'm just focusing on Isaac. When they converted to Quakerism, which if you just think about um, how difficult that must have been, and what a decision that must have been, and what like problems that got him involved, that must have caused for him. It's a big decision. Like other Quakers, he wrote a lot more than Mary Fisher, so like I suppose we know more about his theology than we do necessarily about Mary Fisher. But so he's very classic sort of second generation Quaker in terms of things he talks about. So he talks about the inner light or inward light, for example, this direct experience of the divine that every individual has. Um, he focuses on simplicity a lot and the testimony of integrity. So he faced imprisonment. I'm not sure if he ever was actually imprisoned um, for refuse. So he refused to take oaths, for example. Classic Quaker position. He's certainly a bit more mystical, maybe certainly more mystical than Berkeley in his writings as well. More contemplative, maybe in terms of instead of Berkeley, who was a bit more systematic. He was also a lover because he was who he was. He was also very interested in philosophy. In particular, he engaged with the philosophy of René Descartes. Now, here we're going into philosophy, and so I'm not going to do it too much, but I found it fascinating reading about it at least, and the linking of philosophy um, and Quakerism in the same way that I've been fascinated when I've read that in Helen Holt's book on Rufus Jones, or when I was talking with Ben Wood about Anne Conway, and just how that links. I'm fascinated by it. I just know so little about it. Um, so Rene Descartes, obviously famous for I think, therefore I am, and emphasizing rationality. So he was an Enlightenment philosopher over in France. From what I gather, Isaac Pennington engaged with this, looking at basically the quest for certainty and inner reflection versus rationality and all that sort of stuff. And whilst Descartes obviously focused on reason and doubt and all that stuff, Pennington was looking at the inward light and the inward teacher as a way and to overcome doubt and overcome to something that's super rational, I suppose. So I think I like him because he's less well known, I think, than if we think of other second generation Quakers. So if we thought of William Penn, but there's also Pennington. Anyway, but he's less well known than William Penn, less well known than Robert Barclay, but I think he's just a different type of early Quaker. Most of them are quite rustic, which is fine, but I think it's nice to encounter one which had a very different background, and how he took up his Quakerism. I mean, there was it was as Quaker as they come, but because of his background, he embraced Quakerism in a maybe different way, and maybe in a more intellectual way, and I find that interesting. So my third famous Quaker is Robert Barclay, and so I wanted to talk about Pennington because he was less well known, but I would be remiss, I think, not to talk about Robert Barclay just because not only because I find him very interesting, but also just because in terms of influence that any Quaker has had. I think probably, unless you're bringing in George Fox, he's arguably the one who's had the biggest impact over the longest period of time. He's also quite important for me. I think he was completely wrong decision, but he was the first Quaker. It was the first Quaker theological book that I read, his Apology, which was the wrong decision because it's like thick, and it's not the place to start. It's not if I were to think about five quick. That's a video idea. If I was thinking about like five Quaker books to read to get started, it wouldn't be in there. but it was really important for me and sort of helped me kind of think about how Quakerism has changed since Robert Buckley, but also just seeing where a lot of what we believe today has come from. So again, kind of another intellectual. He was Scottish. I think originally from like a Catholic background or so. He was definitely, or because he was in France and he was studying there, and obviously there, but definitely in a Catholic environment. But created waves when he converted to Quakerism. So he is most famous for Berkeley's apology, is what it's called, but the full is the apology for the true Christian divinity, um, which was originally posted. Oh my goodness me, modern. It was originally published in Latin and was only later translated to English. So again, we're kind of getting the kind of the highbrow intellectualism there. But it was basically it was basically a summary of all the arguments that Quakers have had to put to people who were attacking them, and basically stating out the Quaker belief on pretty much everything. So it is basically a systematic theology in the Quaker sense, and I will do a video on it in a bit more detail because it is interesting. I'm not saying at any point that I think this is like what Quakers believe now, or that this is still like canon or anything like that, but I think people have gone back to it again and again in terms of and in trying to understand what the early Quakers were saying about believing. People do look to that as an important document. So, if you think about what comes up in it, so the inward light comes into it, the immediate revelation is in there, the classic Quaker view on the scriptures is in there, the idea that it's not inerrant, but just a book. The Quaker view of justification and perfection and that all that sort of stuff, which is very interesting. It really gets explained here in very convincing language. Like I've got, you can read it in the 17th century English version if you want, but there is a modern edition by Dean Friday, which I would recommend just because it makes it easier to read. And so he's there as one of my Quaker heroes, not only because that was important to me, but because I think this book has been, where lots of people have taken up the Quaker position from and further developed as time has moved on. It's also, as I mentioned in the video before, it's kind of like the standard for, if someone writes a good Quaker theological book, if they say it's the next it's the next Berkeley's Apology, then you've done well. I mean, I hate that linking, but it's used as a shorthand for this is a good Quaker theological book. Moving into the 18th century now for my fourth uh, um, Quaker hero, I realized that the last one probably shouldn't be too much of a surprise for anyone who's watched a lot of these videos, but I recognize that this is mainly quite early friends, but it's just the way it's gone. I can do a modern one, but I think fair enough. This is. I think I think if you were to ask like anyone from any other denomination about their five top whatevers, they would probably all be from the earlier periods of that tradition as well. Like if you asked a Lutheran, it'd be like Melanchthon and Luther and people around that sort of time. I suppose, but hey ho, that's how I've done it, and I'm sticking to it. So here we go. My next one, going into the 18th century, as I said, is Benjamin Lay. Now, Benjamin Lay is probably best known outside of, probably out of all these well-known, all these Quaker heroes of mine, he's probably the best known, and that's mainly because of his work on abolitionism in America. So he was a Quaker, but I think ultimately he was disowned from his meeting. So he was born in England, but then moved to America, like lots of them did. But he grew increasingly uncomfortable with slavery. So he was a sailor, and obviously just living at that time in America saw slavery and grew increasingly uncomfortable with it. And I think he probably would be what Bayard Rustin would call a angelic troublemaker. So, for example, he there was an instance with some berries and a book, and he like drove a sword through the berries and said, like, got to shed the blood of those persons who enslaved their fellow man or something along those lines, and he stabs it, and the juice goes everywhere onto the other slave owning Quakers or whatever. And so he's always doing stuff like this, so getting himself into trouble an awful lot, and standing up for what he believes in. And he's a very interesting guy. So he's a small man, like a very, very small man. So it looked quite strange. He ended up living in a cave, which is not very Quakerly, but probably should be. I mean, you can't get more simple than a cave. And he was a militant vegetarian, which you don't get too often in early Quake. I mean, obviously now today it's pretty much gospel, but like back in the 18th century, very, very strange. Similarly, he sort of foreshadows in many ways John Woolman. So he also tried to, wear simple clothing. He grew his own flax for his clothing, and it was due to not using products which were used by slaves, made by slaves, which is what John Woolman later goes on to do. But he was doing it before it was cool. And so I think he was also against the death penalty as well, which is nice. And I'm not sure how many Quakers it's so early a point. I think basically he was just a bit of a revolutionary, even amongst Quakers, which is nice. Sort of trailblazing that path that John Woolman would then follow. And so because of that, because of his, starting a long long tradition of Quakers. Eventually, it must be stated, eventually supporting abolition, because of excellent larks with berries. He takes the place number 4. And so, as I said, without much of a surprise, that my last and probably my dearest Quaker hero is John Wilhelm Rowntree, born 1868 and died tragically young in 1905. He too was a son of York, so when I think at this point it's beyond question that York is the capital of Quakerism. I think he really just like symbolizes that transcendence that York has undergone since imprisoning Mary Fisher outrageously. It has now come into its own as the true Quaker capital. So he's Rowntree is a very well known name in the UK, especially in York. And that's because Rowntree's was a very well-known confectionery company, which I did in my Christmas video. So more about that if you want to go and check that out. Now, why do I like John Wilhelm Rowntree so much? I like what I read about him. I think it seems like if it's the kind of theology I think that resonates the best with me. So that's going to be that's going to be very personal. I like, for example, that he was also very into education and for providing a better education for, especially for adults. So he was part of the adult school movement, very, very committed to that. Not just necessarily from a Quaker position, but also from a Quaker position as well. So he was also very influential in starting up Woodbrook as a center of Quaker education and research, but also in his theology, he was vitally important from moving Quakerism in the UK from evangelical Quakerism with a big E to modern liberal Quakerism. So he pretty much like caused like a coup d'etat. I mean, I will do a whole video on him. Obviously, I will. But he basically took. Helped to set up a conference in Manchester in 1895, very well known in Quaker circles, as a sort of beginning of modern liberal Quakerism. So that shift from evangelicalism to liberalism. And that was largely led by him and other people of his age. So he was not so very old in 1895. And so it was this new generation of people who sort of were looking to effectively making Quakerism fit with biblical criticism and science. He was best friends with Rufus Jones. He was completely on board with Rufus Jones's understanding of the inner light against the inward light, or any other iterations of the light in the past. So linking it to the conscience, which I don't particularly enjoy, but I'm not sure whether that John William Roundtree actually does that in the same way that Rufus Jones eventually does. I don't think he would have been against it, though, necessarily, but it's not really his angle. He was not a psychologist like Rufus Jones was. But he was, as I said, a lot about open, basically trying to make Quakerism less dogmatic, because he was very upset that, young Quakers, especially, the bright young Quakers, were leaving Quakerism because they thought it was, there was no meat to it. So he wanted to give Quakerism that meat, and that didn't just mean in theology, but he wanted to also really analyze Quaker history and teach that. And so that hadn't really been done. And so he had this great idea of having, a series of books explaining in detail, going through the different parts of Quaker history and explaining that for the modern reader. And unfortunately, he died before that was taken up. But then his great friend Rufus Jones, along with William Charles Braithwaite, took the mantle on and eventually published the what they called the Roundtree History series, which is very influential, and sort of stating in the kind of same way that Robert Barclay stated by then the second generation Quaker view, the early modern liberal Quaker view of Quakerism. And so I think, in summary, I think that is, if I had to say it in not very many minutes, that's why I like him so much. And so yes, there we go. Those are my top 5. Who are yours? What are your top 5? Who are your top 5 Quakers? Are they different to mine? Obviously, this is like, if push comes to shove, who would I come out with? I could go on and list 20. I could list 100, whatever. But I think if push came to shove, and I had to choose five influential of my Quaker heroes, those are my Quaker heroes. So who would you choose, and why? Let me know.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.